I am thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Shannon Withycombe, today. Dr. Withycombe is an associate professor in the Department of History here at the University of New Mexico. She's a historian of medicine who works in 19th and early 20th century women's health. And she's particularly interested in bodies and identities and how the two are constructed in thinking about reproduction and medicine. Her recently published book called Lost: Miscarriage in 19th Century America traces the meaning of miscarriage in 19th century America. Placing women's personal writings about pregnancy loss alongside physicians' publications on the topic, the book investigates the transformative changes in how Americans conceptualize pregnancy, medical authority, fetal tissues, and women's reproductive destinies. For her next book, Dr. Withycombe is researching the development of prenatal care in early 20th century America. She will be examining the medical, political, and eugenic roots of this public health movement that has been viewed by some as one of the most successful achievements of American medicine. In her talk with us today, Dr. Withycombe will be speaking with us about the racialized history of American motherhood and reproductive medicine. Dr. Withycombe, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us here today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Melissa, both for the invitation and for that lovely introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides because during the test earlier, it took quite a while. So I'm going to sort of be talking while this happens, as we all have learned how to do in our new pandemic world. Here we go. Oh, that was quicker. All right. So actually, as I was talking with Melissa right before this talk, I was saying that when she first asked me to do this talk about 3 weeks ago, I already had some ideas about, okay, yes, I can piece some things that I've been working on together for this talk. And then I became aware of something new and that really sort of changed the framework for this talk. So I'm actually going to start with something that was in the news quite recently, that sort of one of the unfortunate things that happens when you're a historian, especially a historian of reproductive health and reproductive justice, is there are often things in the news that are very applicable to your historical studies. And what I became aware of about 2 weeks ago was that there's this there's popular trend in parenting advice that really struck me. And I started to look around for it, and I could find it in lots of places. It was on sort of parenting advice websites, the sort of, I think, poorly named mommy blogs, but also in news sites such as sort of local NBC affiliates, as well as NPR. And what struck me advice was not that it sort of offered any innovative practical tips for sort of how to deal with your toddler, but rather it was completely focused on study 19th and 20th century America. And every time I sort of write about it or talk about it, one of the things I write about is how damaging this narrative is, especially for women of color and their children. So I know you're all dying to know what this parenting advice is. It is sort of this trend right now, and I think it's been popular for maybe a couple of years. I'm still sort of learning more about it. Talking about how we, and I do want to place the we in quotes, packaged and targeted at particular groupers, particularly mothers, right? But how we can learn from quote unquote ancient cultures to raise better children. So just to give you an idea of some of these, the sort of stories that I came across when I started to look around for it, the two most popular, apparently, quote unquote, ancient cultures these days are Mayan and Inuit. So Inuit parents can teach you how to be a calm parent. You can learn the secrets of a Maya supermom. You can get your toddler to do chores if you use the quote unquote Maya method. And you can learn from Inuit moms to tame your 3-year-old's anger. This trend has culminated, I think, and this is what brought it to my attention, in the publication of a book that just came out last week that's been getting quite a bit of press. And that is a book called Hunt, Gather, Parent: When Ancient Cultures Teach About the Loss of Raising Happy, Helpful Little Humans. Now, there's a lot of issues with this narrative, certainly with the title of this book alone, that we could cover a whole nother hour. But what I we can learn from ancient cultures, create a particular comparison, a particular dichotomy is, again, an old dichotomy and one that has been very damaging throughout American history in terms of motherhood and reproductive health and medicine. So that dichotomy, and it's, I think, well represented by a picture of the author. This is the author of that book with her daughter as she's doing field work for this book. And I think here is a representation of her learning parenting tips from the ancient Mayan culture that she is living with for a few weeks. But the dichotomy that this creates is, on one hand, you have these quote unquote ancient cultures who, in terms of parenting advice, right, are always women of color. And on the other hand, you have what is often referred to as modern American women, but those modern American women are always white and usually middle and upper class. And one of the things this not only creates this dichotomy is natural, that there's only two groups, and that this is a very sort of stable dichotomy that has been around for a long time, so we can keep sort of using it. And this dichotomy and the narrative built around this sort of natural or biological separation to groups has been deployed throughout American history in medical ways, in political ways, in social ways, and economic ways. And what I want to do today is give you a couple examples of that and show how it's been deployed, in ways that always results in harm, damage, and even death of women of color and their children, and how we can sort of look out for it today, because it's still doing the same thing. So I'm going to start actually a couple centuries before this with early modern birth practices. So prior to about the middle of the 1700s, throughout Europe, the most common birth scene was something like this, a very women-centric social event. So when a woman thought her time was approaching, she would call in her women. This could be family, friends, neighbors, and sometimes included a female midwife. And this wasn't just, and this group of women weren't just there to help support her and help her deliver the child, but were also there as a social support network to do cleaning, to do cooking, to care for her other children. And throughout Europe, the sort of female centricness of it wasn't always constant. Sorry, there we go. Husbands would sometimes, often actually be involved, usually to actually provide physical support for the woman while she was pushing. But the sort of constant in most of these, certainly Northern Western European nations, was that this was a social event, and this was an event that did not require professionalized medicine. Starting in the middle of the 1700s, however, that started to change. So a group of white elite physicians in places like Edinburgh, London, and Paris began to write and to speak out saying, actually, you know what? This type of birth is actually the most dangerous. Women, if you're afraid of the sort of debility, if you're afraid of harm, if you're afraid of death of either you or your child from childbirth, because those were all very real possibilities, this is actually the most dangerous. You need to call on us. So physicians, like probably the most popular at the time was William Hunter. Physicians like William Hunter started to write this, say, you need to come to us. And usually they sort of rationalized or the reasons they gave for why they were better than female midwives for childbirth relied on three things: university education, tools, and drugs. And I just want to sort of detail what these mean at the time to give you a better idea of, again, sort of who Hunter and his compatriots were really hoping to draw in as part of their midwifery business. So in terms of what university education meant or medical education meant in the 18th century, what that meant was sort of sitting in a room for a couple months at a time, maybe for 2 years, and sitting in that room with a bunch of other elite white males around you who are very wealthy, because it costs a lot of money to go to medical school, and listening to your professor read from sort of a book of the old masters. This could go back to texts from Hippocrates, Galen, Vesalius, sort of these sort of old masters of European culture, really, and learning. And that was about it. Listening, reading, that was it. So in terms of what you learned about birth, it usually looked something like this. And this actually comes from Hunter's book itself, which is a beautifully illustrated atlas of the gravid uterus. If you ever have a chance to see one in person, you should look at it. It's amazing. But I just want you to sit with a moment, sort of, this is what you learn about birth. You never actually see a live birth throughout your medical education. You see this. There's very little and basically no clinical experience in medical education in Europe and the United States, really up until the turn of the 20th century. So this is what you know about birth when you get your MD. And one of the things we find is physicians who then go to practice and to enter the birthing room talk about, shall we say, a very steep learning curve, right? If this is what's in your head, and then you enter your first birthing room, right? It doesn't look like this. It doesn't sound like this. It doesn't smell like this. It's a very different experience. And it's quite difficult for a lot of practitioners, their first 1, 2, or even 10 birthing scenes. But this is sort of part of their rationale, Hunter and others, to say, this is why we should be involved in birth, is because we know this stuff, right? Midwives don't know this stuff. The other 2 things, though, they want to talk about is tools. Primarily, they're promoting forceps at this time, which midwives throughout the 18th and 19th century are mostly avoiding because they find forceps are dangerous and they have other methods of helping a woman through labor rather than the sort of instrumental methods. Also, male physicians are sort of marketing themselves as, we've got great drugs. A drug of choice for many of the physicians, is laudanum. Laudanum is opium mixed with alcohol. It makes you feel really good. Unfortunately, it also slows or can even bring labor to a stop, which increases complications because it can lead to exhaustion of the mother and all sorts of bad things after that. But this is sort of how these physicians are framing themselves, is we have all of these particular things that midwives don't, and this is why we are better equipped to save you, to give you an easier childbirth experience, and to save your baby. Now, this was a pretty hard sell throughout Europe and eventually in the United States when American physicians were trying this argument out at the time. And it was a hard sell because at the time, right, any man who said, I want to go hang out in the bedroom of a woman who's not my wife, I want to look up her skirts, and I want to even put my hands either upon or inside her most intimate parts. There was lots of accusations that these men were sexual deviants, actually. So part of what these men had to do was figure out and construct a narrative for why they should be involved in birth, beyond just this sort of, here's the things we have that midwives don't. And the way they did that was actually very racially based, because it turns out people like Hunter, they're not interested in attending all types of childbirth, right? They're interested in attending childbirth of families who are sort of esteemed and as educated as they are, the sort of quote unquote most valuable members of society. And relying on by that time, sort of old racial taxonomies, they're often sort of represented, and this goes back at least to Carl Linnaeus in the early 1700s, but even he wasn't the first to do this, right? But these sort of constructions of almost ladders of hierarchies of racial difference, where white is, of course, always at the very top, sometimes also including different animals as well as part of this hierarchy. But relying on these sorts of notions of racial hierarchy that were at the time very seen as very biological, very natural, very scientific, these male physicians started to make an argument that women of the quote unquote lower races did not need the help of a trained physician. But civilized white elite women, oh, you better believe they needed a doctor. And this was a narrative that was, again, sort of started in Europe in the 1700s. By the early 1800s, many American physicians, again, elite white males, were interested in adopting this. And the way they did this in the American context was to say, in medical journals, teaching texts, and also personal writings, these men often referred to particularly Native American and African American groups as the quote unquote most barbaric, as closest to nature, as most animalistic, and generally lacking in civilized morality, social norms, family structures, and sexual practices. Because these groups were so quote unquote naturally uncivilized, they had an easier time giving birth. They had much less pain and faced little danger from death or infection. I mean, one of the sort of logical lines that these physicians were making was, because these groups are, again, sort of more animalistic and closer to nature, this is the same as saying, well, I don't need to provide a doctor's assistance for a cat to give birth. So why would these particular groups need a doctor's assistance to give birth? One St. Louis physician wrote in the auspicious pages of the American Journal of Obstetrics and Diseases of Women and Children, quote, primitive people's labor may be characterized as short and easy, accompanied by few accidents and followed by little or no prostration. Relying on what he saw as proof from groups like the Modoc communities and the quote unquote savage people of the Antilles, he claimed, the nearer civilization is approached, the more trying does the ordeal of childbirth become. So according to most of these white physicians, white women of upper classes had a higher degree of civilization, which resulted in having more fragile nerves, which resulted in having a higher sensitivity to pain, and bodies that were more fragile and could not normally withstand the horrors of birth without a lot of help. And what kind of help? Well, the help of an educated, elite white male who was also of sort of high civilization. These white physicians were not the only ones who were relying on this biological argument for racial difference. These constructions of African Americans and Native Americans as natural or sort of biologically barbarous also were quite helpful in supporting the practices and policies of enslaving Black Americans and Indian removal and reservations. If doctors claimed that African Americans were naturally or biologically less moral and lacked quote unquote normal family relations, then where was the problem in raping enslaved women, separating enslaved mothers and children, even infants, and many other common abhorrent practices under slavery? Similarly, if doctors claimed that Native Americans were more animalistic and did not feel the same degree of pain or familial affection that whites did, then where was the problem in kidnapping and enslaving children or marching indigenous groups thousands of miles by foot in extreme elements? The medical construction of race in the 1800s not only created an entree for white men to deliver white babies, but it also enabled racist violence and injustice. And it wasn't just professionalizing obstetricians who found use in these racialized biological narratives. Another group of physicians trying to find their way in the world in the early and mid 1800s also used these notions, particularly the biological facts about enslaved Black women. Now, one thing to note about American medicine throughout the 1800s is that it was viewed by Europe as sort of backwater provincial. While England, France, and Germany could boast great names that we still know today, such as Edward Jenner, Joseph Lister, René Laennec, Louis Pasteur, and Robert Koch, those countries mostly looked down upon American medicine as immature, with few university medical programs and no sense of a medical tradition. But there was one area in which American medicine did shine, and it shone on an international stage, and it helped spur on professional organizations like the American Medical Association, and then numerous specialties that formed by the turn of the 20th century. And that one area was in gynecological surgery. It was American physicians who developed cutting-edge surgeries such as ovariotomy, developments in cesarean section, and vesicovaginal fistula repair. So let's get into the story a little bit about the story of vesicovaginal fistula and its role in building the profession of American medicine. For those of you who aren't familiar with this injury, a vesicovaginal fistula is a tear between the vaginal canal and either the rectum or the urethra that can result from a difficult birth or childbirth in a woman who is suffering from malnutrition, from STIs or other chronic health conditions. And tear is the most common word used to describe a vesicovaginal fistula, but if you ever talk to someone who's experiencing that, has experienced rather a fistula, tear is way too sort of a benign of a word, right? This is an injury and a condition that can lead to, even today, multiple surgeries and years of recovery and physical therapy and all sorts of things, because it can affect bladder control, it can affect pelvic floor, all sorts of things. But this was a common occurrence among enslaved Black women of the 19th century, right? Malnourished, high rates of STIs, other chronic health conditions. And it was a concern of their enslavers, not because they didn't like seeing women suffer pain and debilitation, but rather it impacted these women's ability to reproduce. In 1808, Congress passed an act to ban the importation of enslaved humans. So if enslavers wanted to bring or sort of build or sustain their labor force, they had to rely on the reproductive labor of Black women. They used rape, coerced and forced sexual acts between enslaved men and women to accomplish this. And vesicovaginal fistulas could cause infertility, miscarriages, and severe debility or even death if a pregnant woman continued to full term while having one. Enslavers were very interested in solving this problem. Again, not as a problem of women's health, but as a problem in increasing capital. Enslavers in Alabama and eventually across the nation found their hero in a physician by the name of J. Marion Sims. Sims was a country doctor who soon after moving to Montgomery, Alabama, began to be approached by enslavers in the area asking about possible treatments for fistulae. Sims decided it was a worthy problem to solve, potentially from an economic standpoint, as very wealthy enslavers were interested in this solution, and he started to work on the problem. Sims leased and bought multiple enslaved women to serve as his experimental population. And between 1845 and 1849, he conducted surgeries on these women, testing out aspects such as suturing materials and suturing positions. Sims did name 3 women in his autobiography, Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha, but there was at least 12 women total who lived on Sims's plantation, carried out agricultural and domestic work, and also served as nurses to each other during and after these surgeries, and probably were deemed sexually available to Sims. The first operation Sims did was on 18-year-old Lucy, and he wrote about it later, quote, "Lucy's agony was extreme. I thought she was going to die. It took Lucy 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation." Sims would continue to experiment on Lucy at least 20 more times. He finally perfected the surgery on his 30th attempt on a narca who came to Sims at the age of 17. Within a couple years, Sims published his technique to widespread acclaim by the American medical community, and in his own words, he soon had the largest surgical practice in Alabama. Sims soon afterwards decamped to New York City, where again, according to him, he was so popular and greatly beloved that he was able to quickly raise funds for the first women's hospital in the country, where Sims continued to experiment, this time on poor Irish women, in order to help upper-class white women and their fertility. This medical advancement of the vesicovaginal fistula repair, one that was heralded by organizations like the AMA as pioneering and important, and viewed by many white male physicians in the 19th century as a linchpin for the creation of a medical profession that served both as a point of national pride, but also as an international accomplishment. And in fact, Sims, after he moved to New York, did an entire European continental tour to demonstrate his technique. But this medical advancement was motivated and rested solely upon the racial understandings of biology that constructed enslaved Black women as impervious to pain, strong of body, less moral and modest, and less human. Again, I want to remind you, this is not 20 to 30 surgeries on an arm, right? This is 20, 30 surgeries on a woman's vagina. From the very beginnings of the profession of obstetrics, white male physicians relied upon notions of biological difference between racial groups that not only served the purposes of racial injustice and violence, but also helped lay the foundation for American medicine that rested upon a racial hierarchy. Let's turn to the second example, which picks up around the same time in the middle of the 1800s and concerns reproductive control legislation. So it turns out from about the 1840s to the 1860s, there was a bit of a golden age of reproductive control for American women. The Industrial Revolution and resulting urbanization helped to spur on an increase both in demand for fertility control and availability of contraception and abortion in unprecedented ways. So in terms of the demand, as young women flocked to cities for working class employment like factory jobs, but also pink-collar jobs like store clerks, they were moving away from traditional communal and familial knowledge about reproduction and the means for making their own contraceptive concoctions. So 50 years previously, right, if you're living in an agricultural community in a place like Kansas, not only are you learning from your mother, your aunts, your grandmothers, and even neighbors about sort of best ways to prevent pregnancy or space out your children, they're also often made by natural plants that are either you can grow in your backyard or you can go forage for. So these women who are moving to the cities from these rural areas are not only being separated from that knowledge because they're no longer hanging out in those women's networks, but they're also being separated from the means to create them themselves. And of course, this is many of these women are also not just sort of moving from Kansas to New York, they're also moving across the Atlantic as immigration increases at this time. And as young women flocked to cities for working class employment like at the same time, these women needed fertility control in order to fully take advantage of the new industrialized opportunities. With no money for children, no space for children in an overcrowded tenement, and no desire to face the lost work from pregnancy and child raising, this new group of women was eager for contraception and abortion. Also, fewer American families needed those sort of large groups of children for farm labor or agricultural stability. And instead, middle-class families strive for smaller families in order to spend more resources towards the social and financial success of each child. This new industrialized America also included fertility control methods and marketing that came out of sort of technological advancements in a way that Americans had never seen before. The vulcanization of rubber, developed in 1844, meant that condoms, diaphragms, and postcoital douching syringes could be made as much more durable, comfortable, and cheaper products than were previously available. Improvements in pill manufacturing increased the array of contraceptive and abortifacient pills, as well as tonics and syrups that flooded the market. And the print revolution gave space for all of these entrepreneurs to market directly to women much more cheaply through mail order catalogs, print ads in newspapers and magazines, and on posters and bustling urban street corners. Finally, as part of a broader American movement of education and self-improvement, knowledge of anatomy and physiology became a highly sought-after commodity, peddled in millions of domestic health guides, on lecture circuit tours, and even by door-to-door salesmen. This physiology often included methods for fertility control, now newly available to any woman who could read or afford to attend a public lecture. And this is one example who's probably by Dr. Frederick Hollock, who's probably the most famous, both for his books, which sold in the millions, but also he did sort of a nationwide lecture circuit where he would not only talk about sort of these are your lungs and this is what they do, but he would also give information, especially on withdrawal and rhythm method. Fertility control was seen as being everywhere. And for some Americans, advertisements like these were not just about allowing women some measure of control over the size of their families, they were references to sex and were thus obscene. One of those Americans was a man by the name of Anthony Comstock. Born to a devoutly religious family in 1844 in Connecticut, Comstock, like many men of his generation, joined the Union Army in the 1860s and fought in the Civil War. What Comstock found in the war was shocking to him. And it wasn't the violent battles, it wasn't the enslavement of human beings he saw while fighting the South. No, what Comstock was shocked by was the amount of pornography in the Civil War. Like in most wars, young men fighting on both sides traded and shared pornographic images and texts. Unlike previous wars, however, the porn available in the Civil War was both greater in number due to those advanced printing technologies that made printing cheaper, but also more graphic detail due to developments of photographic technology. After the Civil War, Comstock made it his personal mission to stamp out what he saw as destructive to the national character, and that was obscenity. Comstock tried for many years to compel lawmakers rather in New York State, because he moved to New York City because it was sort of seen by him as sort of the most immoral city in the country. And he was finally successful, but not actually at the state level. He was extremely successful. Comstock found enough support in Washington, D.C. to propose a federal anti-obscenity law, and it got passed. The 1873 Federal Comstock Act outlawed the use of the mail to send obscene materials. This included pornographic materials, but also included contraceptive devices and information. So after 1873, it now became illegal as a married woman to send a letter to your newly married sister and tell her about withdrawal. Why did the 42nd Congress deem it necessary to outlaw the mailing of contraception in 1873? Well, let's first take a look at them. There they are. That's the 42nd Congress. It's a very large group of rich white men. Now, I will make this one caveat. This is during Reconstruction, so there are 4 Black members of Congress at this time, but that was a quite short-lived phenomenon, and they didn't have much power, I would say, during this. So why did Comstock, but more importantly, I want to think about sort of the men who voted for this bill. We're not interested in saving the moral souls of all Americans, but really only concerned with white sexual morality. One of the fears in the wake of the Civil War, or rather in the wake of emancipation, was that the degenerate sexual mores, as they would say, of African Americans would corrupt white sexual morality. Remember how earlier I talked about the biological understandings of African Americans that helped to legitimate slavery? While white politicians and physicians described Black Americans not only as impervious to pain and injury from childbirth, they also claimed that African American, both men and women, were naturally hypersexual and lacking in the gentler emotions such as maternal love. Again, these conceptions of race help to explain why it was not only okay, but maybe even necessary to carry out some of the more horrific sexual practices of slavery. By the end of the Civil War, many Americans were convinced of these biological facts of African Americans and feared how these newly freed but severely immoral groups would affect American society. An anti-obscenity law was one way to help stem this new corrupt influence upon the purity of white race. The second reason why many of these lawmakers passed the Comstock Act was in many East Coast urbanized states, they noticed a particular demographic trend in fertility rates. Over the course of the 19th century, fertility rates dropped quite precipitously. And these numbers alone were concerning to many in power. Those who feared what this would mean for the size of a workforce, military, and other groups that relied on mass numbers, but also fearful for those who wondered what American women were starting to do instead of having babies. Things like seeking out higher education, entering professional fields, and agitating in public activism. But what made lawmakers even more nervous was the racial divide in fertility rates. So by 1900, the national fertility rate was around 3.5 children per family. However, it was over 5 children per family for Black women. Black and immigrant women were not decreasing their fertility at the same rates as white women. What was to become of the nation if this trend was not altered was sort of how these gentlemen were talking and thinking. What would happen to white supremacy? To many white lawmakers, restricting the ability for white women to restrict their fertility sounded like a move in the right direction. While a federal ban on using the mail to disseminate contraceptive information may not seem that impactful, soon after 1873, most states, at the time there were 32 in the Union and 24, passed what we now call mini Comstocks, banning manufacture, sale, advertisement, and even the use of contraceptives. Now, for my final example, I want to turn to the development of prenatal healthcare in the early 20th century. By the early 1900s, departments were patting themselves on the back for successful breastfeeding campaigns, efforts to stem infant and childhood illnesses by steering women away from possibly poisonous adulterated cow's milk or mysteriously commercially infant formula, showed a national decrease in childhood mortality. Note, of course, that breastfeeding was not an option for all women, all American women, particularly working class women, which again shows us which groups, and you can see it also in the sort of visual depictions of this campaign, shows us again which groups were most valuable as American mothers. Many of these same groups, feeling flush with success, turned their attention to another new public health campaign, prenatal health care. This was a nationwide public health, medical, and progressive era activist movement that hoped to stem frightening rates of infant mortality. Now you might be asking, what did prenatal healthcare look in the 19-teens, which is when this movement started? Well, it turns out the advice that was actually given out as prenatal healthcare advice was virtually exactly the same as the advice that had been given to women for at least 100 years under the title of pregnancy hygiene, including what you should eat, what you should wear, what sort of exercise, what sort of sleep, how often you should have sex. All of these are almost exactly the same, right? The only addition to this prenatal healthcare advice is, oh, and you should seek out a doctor at least once during your pregnancy, but it's better if you go every month. Like with the campaign with male midwives, the doctors, women activists, and public health departments did not have any new advice or techniques or medicines or anything to help stem infant and maternal mortality through prenatal health care. And in fact, doctors freely admitted, at least in discussions among themselves, in medical journals and at medical conferences, that in the early decades of prenatal healthcare, that the greatest benefit in this medical supervision of pregnancy was not that it would decrease mortality rates, but rather it would bring women into medical supervision to accomplish two important goals. One, widespread syphilis testing, and many early 20th century physicians and public health departments were committed to stamping out venereal disease and driving midwives out of business. And convincing women of the importance of prenatal care could help accomplish that. I will make a quick note because I think it's far too easy in 2021 to think, oh, well, this was obviously a very good move to push women to physician-assisted births. However, physician-assisted births were often much more deadly than midwifery-assisted births up through the development of antibiotics. So at this time. But better yet, public health officials saw prenatal care as a way to strengthen the moral and physical stock of America. Numerous prenatal care supporters in the early 19-teens argued that this medical supervision served as an important eugenic agenda. At the same time that public health workers were utilizing the wildly popular science of eugenics as the backbone for healthy baby programs like Better Baby Contests, and scientific researchers were probing genealogical charts for evidence of heritable intelligence, doctors also argued that prenatal healthcare was, at its essence, eugenic. Not only could prenatal care ensure the survival of infants born to those deemed fit, but also could ensure that infants who were born alive did not end up unfit. As one physician explained at the time, quote, "If all the children who are taken ill would only die, it would not be so bad. But when they grow up crippled, the matter is much more serious." Mary Mills West, who worked for the Federal Children's Bureau and became one of the first popular authors writing about prenatal care as part of this federal move to help provide prenatal care, campaigned for funding for and adoption of prenatal care on the basis that such medical intervention could help decrease not only the early deaths of infants, but also, quote, "those puny, ill-conditioned babies crowd our welfare stations and hospitals, who later fill our institutions for sick, crippled, deficient, and defective children, who live on dragging out enfeebled existence, becoming finally the parents of weaklings like themselves." Indeed, prenatal care, according to West, quote, "will tend to the production of a race of vigorous, normal babies." It may not be surprising to hear that what West meant by normal was very racially shaped, and early campaigns for prenatal health care were frequently framed as antidotes to the moral failings of some of the most concerning groups of Americans. In 1920, the Detroit Department of Health set out to determine the greatest threats to infant survival and also a way to stem frightening statistics of infant mortality. But perhaps more urgently, what they were looking for is they had sort of gotten recently funding from both the federal government and the state government to put towards prenatal care, and they were trying to figure out sort of where they should put the money. What was the most efficient and best use of this money? So the Board of Health poured through records of every infant birth and death in the city from the previous year, and researchers attempted to find correlations between infant death rates and a variety of social factors, looking at first at things like population density and family income. But in the end, they decided that the most important factor in determining the chance of survival of Detroit's infants was race. Although you can see here, what they're actually doing is conflating nativity and race. For some groups like Italians, the researchers grouped women together based on where they or perhaps their parents were born. For other groups, notably white and Black, nativity played no role in the groupings. And in the text of the articles, what the authors actually meant that what they're really interested is in how, quote, the characteristics of each race stock influence the likelihood of infant survival. The authors focus on particular on the high rates of infant mortality for African-American infants, the relatively and somewhat surprisingly high rates for white infants, and the remarkably low rates for Italian and Russian infants. And you'll see in the charts, they keep using the word Russian, although in the text, they actually say Russian Jews many times. So I want to show you two examples from this study to show you how racial narratives impacted public health on the ground. So let's start with the results they got from deaths from respiratory diseases. So they took all of these infant deaths and they categorized them in terms of sort of what kinds of diseases were these infants dying from. So in terms of respiratory diseases, they found the highest rates in African-American and Italians. And this is how they explained these numbers. They said, so respiratory diseases are caused by climate, and therefore it's not at all surprising to find these numbers, as Italians and African Americans who come from warm climates would suffer more in the chilly climates of Detroit, but not so with natives, i.e. white, and Russians. They would have an easier time dealing with snow, apparently. Note again the conflation of nativity and race, for we have no idea how many generations these individuals are from Africa, but I think it's safe to assume it's at least one. And yet they are understood as biologically being better suited to warm climates. By comparison, in the classification of congenital causes of infant death, the researchers find what they first say is an alarming death rate for white women, white infants, and admit they're a bit flummoxed by this. But in the end, they explain this high rate among white women as due to particular behaviors, but not biology. This was the result of high illegitimacy, working women, and poor relationships with health agencies among both Black and white women. So note, when it comes to a category that showed high infant mortality among Black Detroitians, Black Americans, but not white, the conclusion was this must be a biological source. However, in categories where the rates were higher for white infants, it was a behavioral cause. And therefore, the best use of public funds will changing behavior, of course, because you cannot change biology, according to these researchers. Again, the result of this racial biological narrative about mothering and reproducing was that there was more governmental and medical aid to white women. Black women in Detroit were deemed unredeemable. I could talk for another 4 hours and give you many more other examples of this racial narrative, things like coerced or forced sterilization of Native American women and Latino women, so much about midwifery, both in the American South and the American Southwest, which I believe there's going to be a really interesting talk in a couple of weeks about midwifery in the Southwest, and also the construction of medical diagnoses such as crack babies. But I hope that these 4 examples illustrate the very long legacy of biological racism in American motherhood and reproductive health, a racism that results in very dangerous realities for women of color. And we can still see those realities today in racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality. In the past few years, Black women have died from pregnancy-related causes 3 times more often than white women. This racial disparity is not really new, and actually researchers talked about this racial disparity from the early days of prenatal care. But for most of the 20th century, physicians and public health workers attributed this disparity to economic disparity, education disparity, and other health disparities like STIs. It's only recently that researchers, not coincidentally, many of whom were Black women, have shown that this racial disparity of mortality is not all caused by education and economics. One of those studies not just sort of divided these pregnancy-related mortalities by race, but then also did it by education. And to the surprise, maybe not of those researchers, but to the surprise of many public health departments, right? This racial disparity only increased as education increased, right? Proving that this racial disparity was actually sort of about the experience of being Black in America and not about education or economic resources. Black, Native, and Latino women in 2021 are shouldering generations of racism and racial violence, and this has taken a toll on their bodies. But health practitioners are still working within a system that assumes women of color to be impervious of pain, stronger of body, less moral, and less knowledgeable about their own bodies. So when a Black woman approaches a physician or nurse and reports pain or reports something wrong, as Serena Williams did soon after giving birth to her first child, practitioners are much more likely to brush off these concerns, and women of color are much more likely to die as a result. So when modern day narratives tell us white women aren't as good as raising happy children as women from quote unquote ancient cultures, I want you to realize that the flip side of that is the narrative that women of color do not need, nor do they deserve the same governmental, medical, and social support that white women do. And this is a narrative that we need to get rid of. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk, and I am sure that all of us who are attending learned a lot from just the wonderful descriptions that you gave and the evidence showing this long history of trauma in our country. There so far have not really been any questions that have come through in the chat, so I'd encourage all of you who do have questions to please go ahead and enter those now. There was a comment about how insightful your talk was, which I would wholeheartedly agree with, and another which also recommended reading the book 400 Souls by Ibram Kendi, speaking to the lack of rights for children born of African American women. And we are actually hosting a book club on the HSC campus about this book coming up in the next few weeks. And we have been disseminating that, or the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has been disseminating that through some of the channels out there. So I would encourage you to participate in that if that sounds like something of interest to you. And Dr. Withycombe, I did also want to mention that you're absolutely right. There is going to be a talk coming up on the history of midwifery in New Mexico and the Southwest at the end of the month. So I would encourage people to attend that. And we also, as yet unscheduled, are going to have a panel on forced sterilization as part of this month as well. So some of the topics that you touched upon, we will certainly be covering in the future as well. We have another comment about how wonderful the talk was, and now some questions are starting to come in. So I will start with the first one here. In your research, have you found any evidence that the ideas about hypersexualization of African Americans was also applied to Indigenous and Hispanic bodies in the 19th century and post-Civil War era? Yes.
I think among those other two groups, Native women and Hispanic or Latinx women, it wasn't necessarily the exact same sort of narrative, but certainly I think all three groups ended up being constructed as somehow sexually abnormal, right? So that both physicians, but also policymakers, lawmakers would point to particular cultural practices as, oh, this shows, right? This shows that they sort of don't have the same sexual morality of white civilized people. And also, I mean, and the sort of sexual practices were always tied with things like maternal affection or sort of normal family structures, right? So the sort of particular sexual practices or, proof rather that these white lawmakers were using for both Native and Hispanic and Latinx women was not just sort of a sort of sexual deviancy, but also proof, right, that they cannot sort of assimilate, so part of this big story, right, that they cannot assimilate to modern American culture, and therefore we don't really need to spend any money on them. That's often sort of one of the lines of logic through that.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. We have another question. Is there any work being done in the medical field to combat these prejudices? Is that something that you can comment on?
I don't know particularly because I don't work in the medical field, but I will say I hope so. I mean, certainly, right, the research I showed you that is starting to ask these questions in a different way, I think is some attempts to get at that. And I think there's certainly, I've heard a lot more discussion about that we still sort of live in a world that is repeating these narratives of things like Black women are less impervious to pain. So I certainly think there's a lot more attention. As in terms of sort of what work is being done, I don't know. But again, I hope there is work being done.
Thank you very much. I think all of us probably on this video hope that as well. I have a question for you. So as a medical librarian, very interested in the history of medicine, I'm curious about where you do your research and what kinds of resources that you draw upon.
So for the work I'm doing now, I am doing a lot of research on public health programs and women's activism, and as well as medical discussions of prenatal care. The Detroit study actually I referenced was published in the American Journal of Public Health. So that is one place I started, was to see what were the national conversations among public health practitioners about prenatal care and how often things like race and eugenics came up. I'm also looking though at medical publications like in JAMA for sort of the more sort of doctor side things. But then someday when I can get back into archives, what I'm very interested in doing is going to different states all over the country and looking at, again, sort of like I did with the Detroit example, sort of looking at records from some of these prenatal health clinics to see how this is being implemented on the ground. What kinds of literature are they publishing? Where are they setting up these clinics? And what kinds of groups are they hoping to bring into these? I would say in terms of my previous book, I also was very interested in, and if I can do it for this project, I will as well. I was very interested in centering women's voices and getting their miscarriage experiences. So I spent a long time in a variety of archives, flipping through women's letters and diaries, looking for evidence of a miscarriage, which is a very time-consuming process, but for me, a very enjoyable experience because I love reading other people's letters and diaries, it turns out. So I quite enjoyed that.
I would as well. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. A few questions have come in since then, but I'm first going to start with a comment referring to the previous question about training for health professionals. And Kristen Strohsnyder, I apologize if I pronounce that incorrectly, mentions that there is a lot of cultural competency training being included in medical school curricula here at UNM to help combat some of these prejudices. So thank you for that comment. The next question that we received is first thanking you, and then says that there are several certified nurse midwifery specialists in the audience, nurse midwives, and could you comment on or expand your comment upon how the medicalization of birth impacted different communities of women?
Yes. As I mentioned, right, the professionalization of obstetrics in this country was initially geared almost exclusively toward women of means, white women of means. However, one of the things that happened because of the Industrial Revolution, because of urbanization, is a lot of the early sort of growth or the sort of, I would say the growth in physician-attended births actually happened among poor immigrant and working class women in urban centers, because not only were these women being separated from knowledge and availability of contraception, they were also being separated from knowledge and the sort of familiar birth practices. And so sort of out of desperation and having nowhere else to turn, these women would end up in charity hospitals where physicians would be doing sort of a year as a way to get that clinical experience that they weren't getting in medical school. So in a variety of practices, including miscarriage treatment, but also childbirth practices, right? Again, these sort of poor, powerless women's bodies were used as experimental populations, as a place for physicians to work out things, especially once ether and chloroform came around. There was a lot of usage of ether and chloroform on these women as a way to sort of test it out, perfect it, so that then these doctors could take it to their private practice, which were the sort of paying upper class white women. However, sort of past the 20th century, as obstetricians are feeling fairly confident that they're getting the monopoly that they want over childbirth. The numbers aren't sort of, they actually don't get a majority until about the 19-teens or 1920s, over 50% of US births. But a lot of that, the midwifery births that are still happening, say in the 1930s, doctors don't really care about, right? Because doctors are still rich white men. They have no interest in delivering poor immigrant or babies of color. So in places like the American Southwest and the American South, there are long traditions of midwifery assisted births that are either sort of neglected and ignored by state governments, or in a place like New Mexico, there actually was some funding towards at least sort of registering and licensing midwives. Whereas a place like Arizona, actually one of the things they tried to do with early public health funding in the 1920s was to drive out midwives and make it all physician attended births, which actually had devastating impacts on many rural women of color and Native women who could not access these physicians. So yes, the history of midwifery has very long roots in these sort of racial constructions and sort of, again, who these physicians are actually interested in making sure which births are most successful and who are the most valuable. But as I mentioned, right, physician attended births were actually more dangerous in a time like the 1920s than midwifery attended births. So in some ways it was kind of better for a lot of those populations of color that physicians didn't want to attend those births, because it meant they had a longer sort of tradition of midwifery attended births that were much safer at the time.
Thank you so much. We have several more questions. Would you say that there is a continuity between the racism of Comstock laws and current anti-choice efforts?
Yes, certainly I would say there's a continuity in terms of targeting and thinking about who are the valuable populations, who sort of are the most valuable American mothers. Although one of the interesting modern trajectories, right, is this argument that actually abortion is a tool of racial genocide, which is one of the claims that a variety of pro-choice groups have attempted to make. So I think one of the interesting things is taking sort of this rhetoric that has been sort of, by, I think, at least I didn't notice this rhetoric until the 90s or early 2000s, right? But by that time, the sort of rhetoric was seen as bad, as negative, this sort of racial implications, but a utility by these groups of using the same rhetoric. However, I think if you look at who is actually being sort of targeted and supported by pro-life movements, I think it still very much has particular racial and class implications.
Thank you. Okay, one last question for now. Despite the growth of the medicalization of birth, can you expand on whether there was any pushback from midwives or anyone else about the still unsafe practices that were gaining popularity?
Yes, I think there's all sorts of resistance among midwives, among populations, particularly of color. But one thing I do want to sort of remind people or inform people is that among women of means, this was very exciting, especially once it became not just physician attended births, but hospital births, right? Because what it meant is instead of giving birth in your home and having to deal with all of it, right? Your children, the mess, having to instantly take care of this infant, right? By the teens and 20s, especially in urban areas, hospitals were really marketing themselves to pregnant women as an escape, as a vacation, right? Come spend a week in our hospital. We're going to take care of that newborn. You don't have to think about your other children. We're going to do all the washing and the cooking for you. And it's really sort of marketed as this break from the drudgery of your lives. And for many women, they find this extremely attractive. Now, there's also sort of little bits of resistance by also these sort of women of means who are the main targets of this medicalization movement. Things like Twilight Sleep. So Twilight Sleep is an anesthetic that includes scopolamine. So for women who are given it starting in the 1930s in the US, you sort of have no memory of the birth. It doesn't actually totally knock you out, but you have no memory of it. So you wake, you sort of come to, and you have a beautiful baby in your arms, and you don't remember any of the sort of pain and fear, because right, there's still infant and maternal mortality at this rate. But this was something that actually American physicians were very resistant to. It was a trend that started in Europe, especially in Germany, and the sort of richest American women would travel to Switzerland to give birth just so they could have twilight sleep. And there was a lot of sort of agitation among rich white women. Oh, we need to have this. And really, they were the ones who pushed it onto physicians, who finally said, okay, fine, makes you happy. And then realized it was actually very useful for them as an anesthetic.
Well, thank you so much. No additional this wonderful talk and answering all of these incredibly complex and wonderful questions that we received as well. So thank you all to the participants who came and attended as well. It was a real pleasure meeting you and hearing from you. And again, I just want to thank on behalf of all of us today and all of us watching the video as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation.
All right, and now we will close. Thank you so much.